Somebody typed one question into Grok AI, and the answer that came back broke the internet within hours. For over 2,000 years, we were told a story. Slaves, whips, bodies dragging stone under a merciless desert sun. That story is a lie, and the proof has been sitting in the sand the entire time. If you have ever stood in front of the pyramids of Giza, or even just seen a photo, you have probably asked the same question everyone else asks. Who actually built these things? For most of modern history, the answer felt obvious. Slaves built them. Thousands of chained men whipped into submission by cruel pharaohs who cared nothing for human life. That image is burned into our culture. It is in movies. It is in textbooks. It is in the way we talk about ancient Egypt at dinner tables. But here's the problem. It never happened that way, and archaeologists have known this for decades. What changed recently is that artificial intelligence started connecting the dots faster than historians ever could, and the picture it paints is nothing like what you were taught in school. Let's start with where this myth even came from, because that part is almost as interesting as the truth itself. The slave story traces back to a Greek historian named Herodotus. He visited Egypt around 2,000 years after the pyramids were already built, 2,000 years later. Imagine someone today writing a definitive account of the Roman Empire based purely on rumors they heard while backpacking through Italy. That is essentially what happened. Herodotus wrote that Khufu forced 100,000 men to labor under brutal conditions, and that story stuck for centuries because nobody had better evidence to challenge it. Then Hollywood grabbed the idea and ran with it, giving us decades of films showing whips, chains, and misery. The myth became entertainment, and entertainment became assumed history. But real archaeology tells a completely different story, and this is where things get genuinely shocking. In the 1990s, a team of archaeologists stumbled onto something buried beneath the sand near the pyramids. It wasn't a slave camp, it was an entire city. They called it Hit el Ghurab, though most people now refer to it as the lost city of the pyramid builders. And calling it a city is not an exaggeration. Inside this site, archaeologists found barracks long enough to house rotating teams of workers by the thousands. They found industrial-scale bakeries capable of producing enough bread to feed an army every single day. They found evidence of large-scale fish processing operations, pulling protein straight from the Nile. This was not a prison. This was infrastructure built to sustain a massive, organized workforce. Now here is the detail that should stop you in your tracks. Slaves are not buried next to kings. Slaves do not get elaborate tombs. But right next to the pyramids, archaeologists uncovered burial sites belonging to the very people who built them. These were not unmarked graves tossed into the desert. These were structured tombs with hieroglyphic inscriptions, funerary art, and religious symbols. In ancient Egyptian culture, that kind of burial was a privilege reserved for people who mattered. Nobody hands that kind of honor to a person they consider disposable property. And it gets even more specific. Inscriptions found in these burial sites list more than 20 distinct job titles, not vague labels like worker or laborer, actual specialized roles. Titles like overseer of the side of the pyramid. Titles like artisan. This tells us something enormous. The pyramid builders were not an undifferentiated mass of forced labor. They were organized into skilled crews, each with a defined role, moving through a chain of command like an actual construction company. Let's talk about what these workers were eating, because this detail alone destroys the slave narrative. Archaeologists uncovered thousands of animal bones at the site, including remains from 11 cows and 33 goats in a single location. Egyptologist Dr. Zahi Hawass, who has led major excavations at Giza, noted that this kind of diet could have supported around 10,000 workers every single day. Think about that for a second. Beef and goat meat on a rotating daily basis for a workforce numbering in the thousands. That is not the diet of enslaved people being starved into submission. That is the diet of a valued labor force being fed well enough to keep working at full strength on one of the most demanding physical projects in human history. And the evidence doesn't stop at food. Skeletons recovered from the workers' cemetery show something remarkable. Signs of healed bone fractures, evidence of medical treatment, including procedures resembling early brain surgery. Someone was caring for these workers when they got hurt. Someone was investing resources into keeping them alive and functional. You do not spend medical resources on people you consider replaceable property. You spend those resources on a workforce you depend on, a workforce whose skills took years to develop and could not simply be swapped out. So if slaves didn't build the pyramids, who did? This is where the real answer comes in, and it is honestly more impressive than the myth ever was. The workforce was made up of tens of thousands of conscripted Egyptian farmers combined with a smaller, permanent population of highly skilled artisans. Picture two groups working side by side. On one side, you have the rotating labor force. These were farmers pulled from across the kingdom during the months when the Nile flooded their fields and made farming impossible anyway. Instead of sitting idle during flood season, they were organized into labor crews and brought to Giza to contribute to a national project. This wasn't random forced servitude. It was closer to a civic duty, something more like a rotating national service tied to the agricultural calendar. On the other side, you had the permanent workforce, master stonemasons, architects, engineers, artists. These were people who lived at the site year-round, dedicating their careers to a single generational project. Recent discoveries have added even more weight to this picture. Dr. Zahi Hawass and his team uncovered red-painted inscription above the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu itself. These markings include the names of specific labor teams, along with references to organized work shifts. That single detail tells us the builders weren't just physically present. They were organized into named, identifiable crews with a documented rotation system, the ancient equivalent of a construction schedule with crew assignments written directly onto the structure. This lines up with another incredible discovery made years earlier at a place called Wadi El Jarf, along the Red Sea coast. Archaeologists there found the oldest known papyri in human history, a set of logbooks written by a man named Merer, who oversaw a crew transporting limestone blocks to Giza by boat along the Nile and in connecting canals. These aren't vague historical guesses. These are literal daily work logs written by an actual overseer, describing quotas, schedules, and the movement of material for the construction of the pyramid. When you put the inscriptions inside the pyramid together with the logbooks from the coast, you get a workforce that looks less like slaves under a whip and more like a fully documented government-run construction operation with paperwork, shift schedules, and a chain of command. Now, some of the evidence gets almost uncomfortable in how demanding the actual working conditions were, and this matters because it separates myth from a more nuanced truth. This wasn't easy labor. Some records suggest workers operated under a strict schedule with a full day off only once every 10 days, and sometimes just a half day of rest. This was hard, physically brutal work. Moving stone blocks weighing up to 9 tons using nothing but wood, rope, and raw human coordination is not a gentle job under any interpretation. But brutal working conditions are not the same thing as slavery. Miners in the Industrial Revolution worked brutal hours in horrific conditions, and nobody argues they were literally enslaved. The distinction that matters here is compensation, choice, honor, and care, and on every one of those measures, the pyramid workforce looks nothing like the whipped, chained mass of popular imagination. Let's step back and really absorb the scale of what these workers accomplished, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to believe, even with all the evidence in front of us. The Great Pyramid of Khufu required moving approximately 6.5 million tons of stone. Some individual blocks weighed as much as 9 tons each. All of this was accomplished using wood, rope, human muscle, and an organizational system so precise that the pyramid remained the tallest human-made structure on the planet for thousands of years, all the way until the construction of medieval cathedrals in Europe. Think about that. A civilization with no modern engineering tools, no steel, no combustion engines, built something so structurally sound it stood unmatched for millennia. This is exactly the kind of pattern matching that modern AI systems are remarkably good at. Feed a system like Grok the totality of the archaeological record, the inscriptions, the burial sites, the diet evidence, the medical records, the papyri logbooks, and the shift schedules, and it can assemble the full picture almost instantly, cutting straight through centuries of myth built on a single second-hand account from a Greek tourist. The pyramids were not built by suffering slaves under the crack of a whip. They were built by an organized, fed, medically cared for, honored workforce of skilled Egyptian craftsmen and conscripted farmers, working on what was essentially the largest national infrastructure project in the ancient world. And once you see it this way, the entire story of the pyramids changes. It stops being a story about cruelty and oppression and becomes a story about organization, ambition, and human capability on a scale that is honestly hard to comprehend even today. Thousands of ordinary Egyptian farmers left their villages during flood season, joined a rotating national workforce, ate well, received medical treatment when injured, and years later were buried with honor beside the very monument they helped raise out of the desert. That is not a story of slavery. That is one of the greatest cooperative achievements in human history, and it took modern archaeology, ancient logbooks, royal inscriptions, and yes, even the pattern recognition of an AI model to finally put all the pieces together in a way that makes sense. Let's dig a little deeper into how this rotating labor system actually worked, because the mechanics are honestly fascinating once you understand them. Egypt's economy revolved entirely around the Nile River and its yearly flood cycle. For several months each year, the fields were completely underwater, which meant farmers across the kingdom had nothing to do agriculturally. Rather than let that labor go to waste, the state organized these farmers into work crews and brought them to Giza during the flood season. This wasn't forced servitude in the way we imagine slavery. It was closer to a structured national labor draft, something historians sometimes compare to a corvée system, where citizens contributed labor to the state instead of paying taxes in grain or goods. The crews were rotated on a schedule, meaning no single group of workers stayed at the site indefinitely. They came, they worked their shift, and eventually they returned home, replaced by the next wave of conscripted labor. This constant rotation explains why the workers' village needed such massive infrastructure. Barracks large enough to house thousands. Bakeries producing food at an industrial scale. This wasn't built for a small, permanent slave population. It was built to process an enormous, ever-changing flow of laborers moving in and out on a predictable cycle. Now let's talk about the engineering side of this, because the logistics involved in moving millions of tons of stone are almost harder to believe than the labor question itself. The limestone used for the outer casing of the pyramids came from quarries across the Nile, at a place called Tura. The larger granite blocks used in certain internal chambers came from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south. Moving stone across those distances, without trucks, without cranes, without any modern machinery, required an extraordinary transportation network built around the Nile itself. This is exactly what the Wadi El Jarf papyri describe. Merer's logbook details how his crew moved limestone blocks by boat, using a network of canals that connected directly to the construction site at Giza. Egyptian engineers built artificial waterways specifically to shorten the distance stone had to travel over land, because dragging multi-ton blocks across open desert was slow and physically punishing. Once the stone arrived close to the site, workers used sledges, wooden rollers, and teams of dozens of men pulling in coordinated unison to drag the blocks up ramps and into position. Some researchers believe the Egyptians even wetted the sand in front of the sledges to reduce friction, a detail actually depicted in ancient tomb paintings showing a worker pouring water directly in the path of a massive stone sledge. None of this sounds like the work of a broken, enslaved population. It sounds like the output of a highly coordinated civil engineering project, backed by a government with the resources to organize quarrying, transportation, food supply, housing, and skilled labor management all at once. This is one of the reasons modern historians increasingly describe the pyramid construction project less like a monument to cruelty and more like the ancient equivalent of a national infrastructure program, similar in spirit to building a modern highway system or a dam, just executed with bronze tools, wooden sledges, and raw human coordination instead of excavators and concrete mixers. There's another piece of this puzzle that rarely gets enough attention, and that's the sheer administrative sophistication behind the whole operation. Somebody had to plan out where every single work crew would live. Somebody had to calculate how much grain, meat, and beer needed to be produced and distributed every single day to keep thousands of workers fed and functional. Somebody had to track which crews were assigned to quarrying, which were assigned to transport, and which were assigned to the actual stacking and placement of blocks at the pyramid itself. The inscriptions naming specific labor teams, teams with names that translate to things like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkor, suggest a system with morale, identity, and competition built directly into the workforce structure. Crews were apparently given nicknames, possibly to build team pride and a sense of friendly rivalry between different groups, almost like sports teams competing to outperform each other on the job site. That is not the psychology of broken, enslaved laborers. That is workforce management, and in some ways, it looks strikingly similar to techniques still used by construction companies and corporations today. It's also worth mentioning just how long this entire construction effort took and what that tells us about the workforce behind it. The Great Pyramid of Khufu is estimated to have taken somewhere between 10 and 20 years to complete. A project of that length requires far more than brute force. It requires long-term planning, consistent food supply chains that could survive multiple flood seasons, a stable chain of command that didn't collapse over a decade, and enough trust in the system that conscripted farmers kept showing up for their rotations year after year without the entire operation falling apart. Slavery built on terror tends to produce constant unrest, escape attempts, and instability. What we see instead at Giza is a system that functioned smoothly enough to complete one of the most ambitious building projects in human history, on schedule, generation after generation. Now, you might be wondering why this question even needed an AI system to answer it, since archaeologists have technically known most of this for decades. And the honest answer is that the evidence has always existed, but it was scattered. It was buried across dozens of academic papers, excavation reports, museum archives, and decades old. Field notes written by different teams working different corners of the same site. A farmer's bones in one report, a logbook fragment in another, inscriptions documented in a completely separate publication years apart. Very few people ever sat down and connected every single thread into one coherent narrative for the general public. That is exactly the kind of task modern AI systems are built for. Feed a model like Grok the full archaeological record, every excavation report, every translated inscription, every papyrus fragment, and it can instantly cross-reference details that would take a human researcher months to manually assemble. That is why so many people describe the experience of asking an AI this question as feeling like a reveal, even though nothing about the underlying facts is actually new. The facts were always there. What changed is how quickly and clearly they could finally be pulled together and explained in plain language. This also explains why alternative theories about the pyramids, aliens, lost civilizations, ancient super technology have struggled to hold up once AI systems started synthesizing the actual evidence. It's not that those theories are uninteresting. It's that they typically rely on the assumption that ancient Egyptians simply couldn't have accomplished something this massive on their own, and that assumption completely collapses once you look at the sheer volume of physical evidence documenting exactly how it was done. We have the quarries, we have the transportation routes, we have the ramps, we have the tools, we have the logbooks describing specific shipments on specific days, we have the names of the men who oversaw the work. There is no missing link here that requires an outside explanation. The mystery was never really about who possessed the technology to build the pyramids. The mystery was about who these builders actually were as people. And that mystery has now been solved through burial sites, dietary evidence, medical records, and administrative documentation, not through speculation about ancient astronauts. What makes this story so satisfying, at least to me, is that the truth turned out to be more impressive than the myth. A cruel king whipping helpless slaves into building a monument is a simple story, almost lazy in how easily it explains something we don't fully understand. But tens of thousands of ordinary farmers, organized by a functioning government, fed with industrial-scale bakeries, cared for by early medical practitioners, working in named crews with internal pride and rivalry, moving stone across hundreds of miles using boats, canals, ramps, and wet sand to reduce friction, all coordinated well enough to finish a multi-decade project without the whole system collapsing. That is a genuinely remarkable human achievement. It says something about early civilization that we rarely give it credit for. Organization, logistics, and cooperation on a scale that still impresses modern engineers who study exactly how these blocks were moved and placed with the level of precision the pyramids display even today. If this blew your mind the way it blew mine, do me a favor and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this channel more than you know. And if you want more videos like this, breaking down what AI and archaeology are uncovering about the ancient world, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The next time someone tells you slaves built the pyramids, you will know exactly what to say. You will know about the workers' village with its bakeries and barracks. You will know about the tombs built right next to the pharaohs. You will know about the 20 specialized job titles, the healed fractures, the ancient brain surgeries, the cattle and goat bones, the shift rotations painted in red above the king's chamber, and the logbooks of a man named Merer, who literally wrote down what it was like to move stone for the biggest building project the ancient world had ever seen. The truth was never hidden. It was buried in the sand, waiting for the right combination of shovels, patience, and modern technology to bring it back into the light. And now that you know it, the pyramids of Giza look a little different, don't they? Not a monument to suffering, but a monument to what ordinary people can build when they work together towards something bigger than themselves. So the next time someone brings up the pyramids at a party, or you see another documentary pushing the old slave narrative, you will have the receipts, real archaeology, real inscriptions, real logbooks, real bones, real answers. Not a myth invented by a tourist 2,000 years after the fact, but a truth pieced together stone by stone, grave by grave, and now question by question, even by artificial intelligence itself. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.